Have you ever tried valuing a larger apartment building using comparable sales? I have, and it doesn't always work very well. In this video, I'm going to show you a better, more consistent way to value apartment buildings. I'm going to explain what that method is, why it's the better method, and show you exactly how to use it correctly. Coming up. Hey guys, if we're just meeting, my name is Vitaly Volpov. I'm a practicing attorney, an active real estate investor, and a part owner of a real estate brokerage in upstate New York. On this channel, I discuss relevant legal concepts as well as best strategies and tips for real estate investing. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so that YouTube notifies you of all my future content. If you enjoy the content in this video, hit the like button and comment down below. Before I talk about the best method, let's talk about the three most common methods used for valuing properties. They include the cost approach, the comparable sales approach, and the income approach. I'll talk about each of them separately, and then I'll focus on the income approach because that is the best approach for valuing large multifamily apartment buildings. The cost approach is how much it would cost someone to build an identical property in the same location using today's costs for labor and materials. If you've ever had an insurance policy on a property, that is most likely the approach that your insurance company used in order to get the policy value. Of course, with this approach, the value comes out to be much more than what you may have actually paid for the property. I've had policies on properties that were purchased for $200,000 come in at $400,000 or more. Obviously, with these types of margins, this is not the best approach to use for valuing a property. A lot of appraisers on their reports will actually discount the replacement cost by some amount of depreciation based on the age of the property and other factors. But when they do that, a lot of their numbers become very subjective and speculative. In fact, although appraisers include the cost approach on their appraisals, they usually do not rely on it for their ultimate determination of value. The next approach is the comparable sales approach, and this is the approach that most people are familiar with. The way a comparable sales approach works is that you take into account all of the features of the property you're trying to value, things like bedrooms, bathrooms, square footage, type of construction, etc. And then you look for recent sales of properties that have similar features. Typically, you want to find sales that occurred within the last 12 months or so and ensure that the properties that were sold were in close proximity to the one being valued. Finally, the last approach is the income approach. And there are actually two types of income valuations that you may see. The first one is the gross rent multiplier method, and the second one is the capitalization rate method. The gross rent multiplier is a number by which you would multiply the gross rent of the building you are trying to value, and in theory, the resulting amount would be its value. The gross rent multiplier number is derived by looking at the relationships between the gross rents and the prices of rental properties that have recently sold in the same area. The way we would get the gross rent multiplier is we would look at several properties that have recently sold in the area and compare their rents to their sale prices. So let's say we had property number 1, which had gross rent of $20,000 annually. And let's say that property sold for $150,000. We would then take $20,000 divided into $150,000, and we would arrive at a gross rent multiplier of 7.5. Let's say that another property sold for $130,000 and it had gross rents of $18,000 per year. We would take $18,000 divided into $130,000 and we would get a 7.2 GRM. Finally, let's say there was property number 3, which had gross annual rent of $15,000 at the time of sale, and it sold for $140,000. We would do the same thing with the calculation, and we would get 9.3 as its GRM. The next step would be to figure out what the average GRM is for the area. We would add up all of the GRMs that we just calculated, and then we would divide them by the number of properties that we looked at. So in this case, it's 24 divided by 3, which gives us an average GRM of 8. Let's assume that the subject property we're trying to value has a gross annual income of $16,000. Now that we know what the GRM is, we can figure out what its valuation would be in this area. We would take $16,000, multiply it by 8, and our valuation would equal $128,000. And I know that some people might say, well, what's the difference between this and doing the comparable sales analysis if you have to go and look at other properties that sold in the area to figure out what the average GRM is? One difference is that these properties don't actually have to be very similar. As long as they're all rental properties and they're all in the same general area, they don't all necessarily have to be comparable to the property you're trying to value. The problem with the gross rent multiplier method is that it does not take into account any of the property's expenses. So for example, let's say that there were two nearly identical 4-unit buildings. Each building produces $4,000 in gross rent per month. Using the gross rent multiplier method, you would think that both buildings would have the same value. But what if one of those buildings has much higher taxes? Or what if one of those buildings has a boiler that supplies heat to all 4 units, while the other building has separate furnaces in each unit? The owner of the building with the boiler will have to pay the utility cost, while the owner of the building with the 4 furnaces will not. Clearly, if the expenses on one of the buildings are much higher than the expenses on the other building, that building would be worth less, as the owner would make less in income. Because the gross rent multiplier does not consider this nuance, it is not a great way to accurately estimate a building's value. This brings me to the capitalization rate method, or the cap rate method. The cap rate method takes into account not only the property's income, but also its expenses. The way you arrive at value with this method is you take the net operating income of a property and divide it by the cap rate. So what does that mean, and how do you do that? The net operating income, or the NOI, is the difference between the property's gross income and all of the property's expenses except for the cost of its mortgage. Let's look at a quick example to help you understand this. Let's say you're looking at a 10-unit apartment building where each unit rents for $1,000 per month. So 10 units times $1,000 equals $10,000 per month. Over 12 months, that comes to $120,000. That is your gross annual income. Let's also say that the annual expenses on this property are as follows: $20,000 for property taxes, $5,000 for insurance, $5,000 for utilities, $10,000 for maintenance and repairs, $10,000 for capital expenditures, and finally we'll add a vacancy rate of 5% of the gross rent, which comes to another $6,000 annually. The total expenses added up together equal $56,000. We then take that and subtract it from the $120,000 of gross rent, and we arrive at $64,000 of annual net income. This is the net operating income in this example. So now that we know the net operating income, the next variable we need is the cap rate, which is expressed as a percentage. The cap rate is simply the amount of money that an average investor would be willing to receive as his or her return on a real estate investment. Cap rate will vary depending on the area and the condition and type of the property. The easiest way to find out what the cap rate might be in the area where the property you're valuing is located is by speaking with a commercial appraiser, agent, or lender. Those folks should be able to give you an idea of what the going cap rate is for the area. Once you know the net operating income and the cap rate, you can figure out the value. An interesting thing about cap rate is that the lower the cap rate is, the higher the valuation will be, and vice versa. If, for example, the cap rate is 10%, then in our hypothetical, the value of the building will be $640,000. That is, we took $64,000 and divided it by 10%, and we got $640,000. However, if the cap rate was 8%, then the value in our hypothetical would be $800,000. So it is very important to use an accurate cap rate. If you're unsure about the cap rate, then it may make sense to be more conservative and use a higher cap rate for your valuation. Normally, a 10% cap rate is pretty conservative. There are much higher cap rates, of course, but those are usually in pretty rough neighborhoods and involve buildings that will be very difficult to own and manage. In more upscale neighborhoods and higher appreciation areas, cap rates can be extremely low. It is actually not unusual to see cap rates in the low single digits in those areas. Investors there are willing to forego a high cash flow return on their money in exchange for the likelihood that their properties will appreciate in value when they go to sell. So why is the cap rate better for larger multifamily properties than comparable sales approach? The reason is that unlike single-family homes and small multifamily homes of 2 to 4 units, there are fewer bigger multifamily properties out there. So their sales are much more rare. Typically, in order to obtain a valuation using a comparable sales approach, you need at least 3 sales of similar properties within the last 6 to 12 months, in close proximity to the property you're valuing. With larger apartment buildings, you're just not going to get that. Additionally, even if you find other apartment building sales in close proximity and time, they are likely to have very different features from one another. This also presents a problem for coming up with a reasonable valuation. The solution to these problems is to simply consider the income potential of those properties by using the cap rate method. This is the method that most commercial lenders will use for valuing properties of 5 units or more. If you're going to buy one of those properties, you will have to use a commercial lender because residential lenders will not lend on buildings of more than 4 units. And if you use a commercial lender, you will likely have to go with a commercial appraisal, which will rely on the cap rate analysis. So this should give you guys a good idea of how the valuation process works for larger multifamily buildings. The cap rate method is the best method for valuing buildings of 5 units or more. Now before you go, I have a question for you guys. Have you ever looked into buying any properties of more than 4 units? And have you ever used the cap rate method to estimate their value? Let me know in the comments down below. And that's going to do it for this video. If you got value from it, do me a favor, hit the like button. And if you haven't already subscribed, subscribe so that YouTube notifies you of all my future uploads. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.